All right, so in 6.6, what we're doing is we're solving quadratic equations. Okay, now a quadratic equation looks like this. Ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Right, so basically a quadratic equation is an equation where you have um, an x squared term, right? So as opposed to a linear equation which has just an x term. So to solve these equations, we have to use factoring. So we're going to always be using factoring. So that's why we've been. So this gives us the reason why we've been studying factoring. All right. So now before we demonstrate how to do that, I want to show you just some equations that are quadratic, but they don't look quadratic, at least at the outset. So here is an equation, and it looks kind of it looks a little bit different than a quadratic. But you notice that if you were to FOIL this out, okay, if you were to FOIL this out, you would end up with an equation like this. You'd have an x squared term, an x term, and a constant. I think it would be what? X squared minus 5x minus 14, right? But this one is a quadratic that's already been factored. Okay, so that's what we're starting there. So we assume that some good soul has come along and already factored our quadratic. And that's what it'll look like. And now we want to solve it. So remember what it means to solve an equation. Find the values that you can plug in for x to make it true. Now, when we're in this form, it's pretty easy to see the solutions. When it's in factored form, it's pretty easy to see the solutions. Because look, 7, if I put a 7 right there, I get 7 minus 7 is 0 times anything, I mean, that turns into a 9, but it doesn't matter. 0 times whatever this turns into is going to be 0. So 7 is a solution, right? And so basically, the solutions we get to this are going to happen when x minus 7, if I can just make that one factor equal 0. So I set it equals 0, and that happens at 7, right? We could see that before. But another solution happens when x plus 2 equals 0. And so that is when x equals minus 2. Right, if I plug a minus 2 in right there, that gives me a 0 times minus 9, but it doesn't matter what this is because 0 times anything is 0. So in factored form, it's easy to see the solutions, provided there's a 0 over here, right? So those are the keys. Let's look at another one here. Solve x minus 3 times x plus 1 equals 0. And this is a quadratic in factored form. So like we said, the way we do this is we take each factor. All we need to know is when does that factor equal 0? And that happens at 3. 3 is a solution, right? Because if you plug 3 in here, you get a 0 times whatever is 0. But also, we take the other factor, set it equal to 0, x equals minus 1. And there's our second solution. So there are two numbers that solve this. So when we talk about solving quadratic equations by factoring, when we factor, we're going to get to this form. And once we get to this form, it's easy to solve from there. So you can see why we're solving by factoring. So let's start with one that is at the very beginning, where we have to do all the work ourselves. All right? So here we go. Let's solve x squared minus 9x minus 22 equals 0. So we're going to factor it. I should say this. The first thing you do actually is you make sure there's a 0. You make sure everything is on this side and nothing is on this other side. And so we're good to go. Then you factor it, and it's going to look like this, right? So we've got to remember how to unfoil. Looks like it's going to be x minus 11, or x and an x, a minus 11, and a plus 2 should work. So you get x equals 11, and x equals negative 2, right? Actually, what I'll put in this middle step, you say, okay, what makes x minus 11 equal 0? Solve that by adding 11. What makes x plus 2 equal to 0? Solve that by subtracting 2. And now you have your two solutions. So it's as simple as that. Factor, then set the factors equal to 0, and set the factors equal to 0, and then solve those two simpler equations. All right, let's try another one. Solve 4x squared minus 28x equals negative 49. All right, so this one we don't have a 0 over here, but that's no big deal. We just need to move that 49 across. So it'll be 4x squared minus 28x plus 49 equals 0, right? And there's our 0. And now we want to factor this. So it's a trinomial. There are no common factors. If there were common factors, we would factor those out. But it does not look like they're factors. So I'm going to try a 2x and a 2x because I know 4x squared. 2x and a 2x will work with that. And then I'm also going to try a minus 7 and a minus 7 because that gives me a 49. And in fact, that's going to work. If I FOIL that out, my outer is going to be negative 14x. My inner is going to be negative 14x, and I'm good to go. So now I just set each factor equal to 0, which they're both the same. So, and now I just solve this equation right here. Okay, you just solve this equation right there, and that's a regular linear equation, so it's not a big deal. You're just going to move the 7 across, divide by 2, and you get x equals 7 halves. And of course, this one is also going to be x equals 7 halves too. We say that 0, since it shows up twice, it has a multiplicity of 2. But the solution is 7 halves. All right? Continuing. Solve x times 2x minus 7 equals 4. Now there's some problems with this one, and the problem is we don't have a 0 over here where we need it. All right, so 2x squared minus 7x minus 4. So I'm doing two things at once. I move the 4 across, and then I'm also distributing the x through. And now it's in the form that I want. I've got a quadratic, something x squared plus something x plus a constant equals a 0. And so now I'm ready to factor this thing. All right, so I do whatever it takes to factor. So probably a 2x and an x. And then now I got to figure this out. I'm guessing it's going to be a minus 4 and a plus 1. And if we check that out, that will be correct. Now it's factored. You set each factor equal to 0. And you solve, right? So this is going to be 2x equals minus 1. X equals minus 1 half. And this will be simply x equals 4. So there's our two solutions. All right. So that's how you solve these things by factoring. Quadratics, that's how we solve them. We've got to solve them by factoring.